You're in the water loop.
Waterloop is made possible in part by grants from Spring Point Partners and the Walton Family Foundation. Hi, this is Travis with Waterloop. If you've listened to this podcast before, you've heard me talk about High Sierra showerheads. I am such a big fan of them for their water efficiency, for the powerful spray they provide, their solid metal construction, no plastic parts involved, and how they're made in the USA. But there are some other great recommendations on High Sierra showerheads. Let me share these with you. They are named Best Showerhead by Popular Science. They are named Best Showerhead by CNET. High Sierra showerheads also gets named Best Low Flow Showerhead by Wirecutter, Tree Hugger, and CNN Underscored. You can also look on Amazon and see that they get tons of high-star reviews from all the satisfied customers. You can get 20% off using promo code LOOP20 at highsierrashowerheads.com.
You're in the water loop.
Hi, welcome to Waterloop. This is Travis. Joined for this episode by Mariana Del Valle Prieto Cervantes. She is with GreenLatinos. She is the Water Equity and Ocean Program Manager. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having us. We're really excited about it.
So there's a lot of different issues to discuss and dive into here. But first, could you explain your organization, GreenLatinos?
Yeah, of course. So GreenLatinos is a national nonprofit organization. We convene an active comunidad of Latino, Latina, Latinx leaders, emboldened by the power and wisdom of our culture, united to demand equity and dismantle racism, resourced to win our environmental and conservation, climate justice battles, and driven to secure our political, economic, cultural, and environmental liberation. One of the things I really appreciate about GreenLatinos, before I even started to work with them, I was one of their members, and I was working for a mostly white-led organization and doing some incredible outreach work in and around ocean conservation, but really felt siloed. I was the only Latina there doing the work that I was doing community outreach to our Latino communities. And so GreenLatinos provide us this space for me to create community with people that look like me, that talk like me, that were Latinos, that were doing environmental work, and was also able to learn a lot from everybody that I've met, and was able to do fly-ins to DC, advocate on ocean issues and other issues that mattered in my community. So that is what GreenLatinos really provides to our members. So I really appreciated them for that. Our vision is to see a healthy and equitable society where communities of color are liberated from disproportionate environmental burdens, are free to breathe fresh air, drink pure water, access transportation, and enjoy clean transportation, and enjoy our majestic public lands, oceans, and of course, our waters. So some of our values that I really appreciate is that piece that I mentioned, community, comunidad, to really come together, form relationships, share resources, cultivate the compassion and power needed to make transformational change within our communities. We really pride ourselves in, not just advocating for the Latino community, but advocating for other communities of color, low-income communities, and disadvantaged communities that have been disproportionately impacted. The fight for environmental liberation is a fight for justice, and we really see it that way. We really pride ourselves in our culture. We're not a monolith, and Latinos are very different, but we do recognize that our culture really brings a whole lot of perspective in how we care about the environment, how we care about water. So we really pride ourselves in doing that and celebrating our identities, and really seeking to make sure that we are accountable to our members, to our stakeholders, to our staff. And so that's GreenLatinos.
What an incredible explanation and mission. I love that you kind of wove your personal connection in there. The idea that you weren't really feeling as connected, or you felt isolated maybe in your positions before. And I definitely want to hear about that. I think when I reached out to you and your organization, I've talked about wanting to gain more perspective myself. Right, I'm kind of that white middle-aged man who really wants to learn more about the water issues that Latino communities face, and I want to share more of these stories and this information with the audience of this podcast. So that's why I'm glad you're on here. I think you all have done some polling along the way about the Latino community's concerns and interest as it relates to water and other environmental issues. I thought the results are very interesting, and especially as it comes to water and where that stands. Could you share some of that?
Yeah, so we did a nationwide study on Latino voters. This was in collaboration with Sierra Club. It was a few years back during the Trump administration. And what the polling really showed us is what we already know in our communities, and that is that it's something that continues to be true to this day, and that is that Latinos are highly concerned when it comes to issues in and around climate change. And one of the reasons why that is because we are disproportionately impacted by them, whether it's the wildfires, hurricanes that we're seeing, especially right now with Hurricane Ida, and other issues. And so because we're experiencing these different issues in our communities, we're more likely to want to advocate for them and want to really do some work around that. The other thing that it showed when it comes to water is that 95% of Latinos feel that fishing and other outdoor activities like hunting, kayaking, camping are a way of life. That protecting our land, protecting our waters, is protecting our culture, our community, our family, nuestra familia. And so that was 95% of Latinos. 90% of Latinos also felt that protecting our waters is really critical for our economy. It's very critical because it maintains and gives us the ability to maintain and create jobs now and in the future. And what they also said, Latinos said in this polling, was that they would want to see the next administration, which is currently the Biden administration, to focus on combating water pollutions by implementing and enforcing strong water pollution rules for power plants and limiting pollutants in water like coal ash, PFAS, and other contaminants that we're seeing in water. And like I mentioned before, this is something that we see in our communities. We see this disproportionate realities, and we want to do something about it. Which I feel like sometimes in society, we're not looked upon as your typical environmentalist. Because we don't have, the outdoor gear when we're going out. We come in groups to the river to hang out, to barbecue. And so I think for that, many don't see us as your typical environmentalist.
Lots of good stuff to follow up on. Maybe not in the questions that we talked about, but I want to just follow up on some stuff. What do you think the typical environmentalist is? Maybe what's that different image maybe than the Latinos that you're speaking of?
Yeah, I think, and I was thinking as a Latina, a brown woman, when I got into the environmental field, everybody was white, middle-aged men. And when I was hiking or, in school, and when I was going to school, when I was going to college, a lot of it was mostly white people in my classrooms. So it has never felt like the environmental field or conservation field was something where I was supposed to be at, but I was really passionate about it and wanted to be part of it. And so in my own way. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I feel. If you Google environmentalists, it's mostly what you're going to get.
Right, kind of like my comment earlier, right, about myself. I'm well
Yes.
aware. I also thought it was very interesting when you said, all Latino community is not a monolith. That should be understood, right? Just like any race or any population, it's not just all. You can't paint it with a broad brush and not all the same. But why is that important when it comes to, Latinos and the environment and water?
Yeah, I think that's important to recognize and understand, because um, it really speaks to our different perspectives that we may have, our different identities. Again, I'm a brown Latina woman that has experienced racial injustices, that has been tokenized, and some of my counterparts, Latina women who are more white passing, haven't experienced some of that. So it's really critical to understand that and to recognize that. There's a lot of talk right now about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and one of the things is really celebrating our differences and recognizing our differences, and that also comes in the Latino community. White supremacy is something that we also have had a part in, and not only that, but we are also the people that there's also the issue of colorism in our communities that needs to be recognized. So that's really important for our community. It's really important to recognize that, and to also recognize that the racial injustices, like I mentioned, are also bleeding into the environmental injustices, and mostly Black, brown, indigenous communities tend to bear the brunt, tend to be lower income, tend to live next to polluted waterways. So it's really recognizing all of that.
Yeah. I'd love to hear a little bit about the work that you all do then as it comes to water. What are kind of your focus areas? Where are you trying to make progress?
Yeah, so one of the things that is clear for GreenLatinos as an organization is that agua es vida. Water is life, and it's a human right. So no one should go without water. That's a basic human right, and that's something that even the U.S. hasn't come out and recognized. We believe that everyone should have access to clean, healthy, and affordable water to drink, to recreate, to enjoy and find solace in for our physical and our mental well-being. So one of our policy priorities here at Green Latinos is water equity. That's one of our core priorities here, and it's really addressing issues through awareness, advocacy for strong policy investments, strong investments, and outreach in our communities that advances clean water access and affordability. Green Latinos works on water equity, seeks to advance Latino communities, but like I mentioned before, not just Latino communities, but all communities through infrastructure investment, as we're seeing right now with all the conversation in Congress, access to clean water in rural and urban communities, and addressing water for affordability and advancement of racial equity. Like I mentioned before, there's disproportionalities when it comes to environmental injustices. And what does that look like in the water aspect? It looks like 2 million people not having access to clean water. And when it comes to Latino communities, they're 2 times as likely not to have access to even plumbing in their households. We're talking about places that are mostly rural, like the San Joaquin Valley, which is made up of communities of farm worker communities, Latino communities. Las colonias down in Texas and New Mexico are also part of that conversation when we're talking about rural communities. And so really recognizing those disproportionate realities in our communities. And then when it comes to affordability, we're seeing water bills rising, and then there's just a study that just came out that is saying that 25 million people don't have access to clean water, and their water is contaminated with toxins. And that counties where Latinos make up 25% of the population or more tend to be the ones that are drinking that unsafe drinking water. So Green Latinos has what's called the Water Equity Working Group. This is a way for our gente, our people, to come together, amazing Latino leaders from all over the nation that are working on water in different water sectors. From small frontline communities, organizations to Latinos that are working in big green organizations, foundations, government agencies, to come together, share ideas, share resources, share lived experiences, because that's what really drives strong policy. And we usually come together for a summit during the year, every year. But during the pandemic, we actually did it virtually. We come together, we reassess what we want to be addressing in the water issues. There's a ton of them, and so what we came up with as far as our goals for this year, next year, is to really recognize water is intersectional. How is it impacting the climate change realities that we're seeing today? How is it impacting our health and our wildlife and habitats? So that's one of our goals there. Another goal is to ensure that there's safe and affordable drinking water in rural and agricultural communities, and also have emergency response set up for water crises, especially what we saw during the pandemic, fighting so that there's no water shutoffs, fighting so that people have their basic human right, their basic PPE during this global pandemic, and then, make sure that we are helping give resources to folks that are impacted by hurricanes and other things that we're seeing due to climate change.
I'm glad to hear a number of those examples you mentioned, places where there's water equity issues. I think from working in water, I'm familiar with a number of those, and from doing podcasts, I'm familiar with them. The number of people in California that don't have reliable access to safe drinking water, it's a staggering number. And like you said, many of those are in the agricultural areas, Latinos who are working in that area, the border area, the colonias that you mentioned. So many people aren't even aware of those areas. So it's important to shine a light on all of that. Absolutely. You mentioned a word I wanted to kind of get your definition of, or get you to explain a little bit more, and that's the intersectional term. I've seen that a lot more over the past year and a half. What does that mean?
Yeah, that intersectional word, I have a love and hate relationship with it. But what it really means is, recognizing that, water issues are not just, water issues. They are being impacted by what's happening in climate change. When we're fighting for, clean water, clean waterways, we also need to recognize that, that is also going to help ensure that people have access to clean water and it's not impacting their health. And so just kind of recognizing the different intersections in the work that we're doing in the different fields out there. And if you're if you're in public health, you should be a water advocate, because water is essential to having physical and mental well-being. And same thing if you're fighting the climate justice. It's not just about fighting coal plants and fossil fuels. It's how are those industries impacting the water, and how do we hold them accountable for what they're doing to our water. So it's really recognizing all of these different intersections that are out there. And Green Latinos tries to do that. We have 5 different policy priorities, but we recognize that all of them are kind of interconnected, and want to make sure that we work towards that as well.
You said a love-hate relationship with the word. Why do you dislike it sometimes?
Yeah, so sometimes I dislike it just because it's used so much, just like diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's often used too much, and it's often used. I sometimes feel as it's more of a blanket to cover some of the deeper problems out there.
Interesting. Yeah, no, sure. Yeah, sometimes words and phrases make their way and they just become overused and
Yes.
thrown around, and things just lumped under that category and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, I get it. You talked about water equity. I think environmental justice is intertwined in that. You touched on that.
Yes.
I'd like to dig into like water equity and environmental justice solutions or success stories. I mean, you mentioned you have a working group and you get folks together. There's a lot of challenges out there, but have there been any kind of any success stories, any progress made, any solutions that you're really advocating for when it comes to water equity and environmental justice?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in the last couple of years, it's really been that pushback, right, that we saw during the last administration. And I guess I should say we tend to focus a lot on federal issues,
Sure.
I guess. And so that was a lot of it, right? Pushing back on those rollbacks, pushing back on the navigable protections rule, known as the dirty water rule, that the Trump administration put forth, the coal ash rule, Section 401. And so that was something that we were really focusing on. But I guess a success story that I would say during that time was, especially during the pandemic, it was ensuring that our members had access to the resources that they needed, making sure that there was a national water shutoff moratorium, which unfortunately I think it's already it's already kind of deadlined. But making sure that folks knew where to find assistance, not just on water but other resources. We also had our Colorado organizer in Tafoya, he was doing some amazing work making sure that the houseless community, because, when the pandemic came, evictions came, or people weren't able to afford their bills and or their rent. So there was an uptick on the houseless community, and making sure that they also had access to clean water. So there was a big push in Colorado to make sure that our houseless community was getting that type of resource to them. So there were trucks that would come with water, and that gave them a form to wash their hands. It gave them some drinking water during the pandemic. So I would say that was a really good success story during the pandemic, in a way for our community to come together and help each other where we could. I think another thing currently, as far as potential solutions, is what we're seeing right now in the push for the bipartisan infrastructure bill and budget reconciliation. There's some huge investments that we haven't seen before when it comes to water. I mean, just the $55 billion in water infrastructure is huge, since the federal government has not given a whole lot of investment to water in recent years. It's still not enough. I think only 15 billion are allocated towards replacing lead pipes, and we know that we need way more than that. I think the estimate is $60 billion. So there's 75% of lead lines that are going to go untouched. Because there's not enough investments in water infrastructure, even though it's still huge, the amount that we're getting. And it's also during the CARES Act, there was the it's not a permanent solution, but there is a low income water assistance program that we advocated for, and it's in HHS, Health Human Services, and so that should be providing some funding so that people can pay their bills and pay their water bills, which is critical, like I mentioned, during this pandemic, and critical to have access to your basic form of PPE. And so what we're currently working on is, we know that that program is not perfect. There's a lot of barriers for our communities, and not just, low income and communities of color, but also our undocumented communities aren't able to access any of this funding. So there's a lot of barriers for people to even access the funding to pay their water bills. And we're working currently right now to see if there's any way that we can do that during the bipartisan during these negotiations with the bipartisan infrastructure bill and budget reconciliation. Currently in the BIB, there is a pilot program under EPA to provide funding for low income water assistance, but there's zero funding for it as of now, since it is a new program, and there's only a 40 city cap on it. So meaning that EPA can only establish this in either 40 cities or 40 utilities. I forget which one, but there's definitely a cap. So we're working right now to get rid of the cap, add funding to this, and if we can't do that, add more funding to the HHS program, which is not a permanent program at the moment. So really looking for different ways where we can make sure that water becomes affordable to the ones that are the most vulnerable in our communities and are unable to pay their bills. So I would say that is a huge potential solution and huge success story, but in it of itself, since there's a little bit more investment in water. And also, I mentioned the water equity working group. And again, one of the things that we want to do is in GreenLatinos is provide access to leaders in government at the federal level, provide access to resources and funding opportunities for our members. And so recently we were able to have a couple of dozen of our members from different parts of the country, from California to Puerto Rico, come together virtually and meet with EPA Office of Water to share their concerns. And, we want to make sure that their voices are being heard, that we're uplifting our people, our gente, and that, it's falling on the right ears, and making sure that we're part of the table, we're part of the decision-making table.
Sure. You mentioned something else that I kind of wanted to touch on. You mentioned undocumented population, but along with that issue, there's a real growth in the Latino population in the United States. It's a growing population. It's a growing portion of the United States population, and I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on how that figures into these water equity issues and the water equity work. It would seem to give the Latino community more, I don't know if power is the right word, but more ability to have influence as the population grows. Yeah, that's a good point, and I think we are seeing a little bit of that. But I think there's still a lot of inequities, even when it comes to our population and how we're being represented, right? I was just on one of our calls with one of our Green Latino members that was helping with the census. And, there was a real challenges to getting an accurate count of our population because of the pandemic, but also because our community doesn't trust the census, and especially our undocumented community. And so we saw a lot of places where we know the population is getting bigger actually drop.
through the census, so we know that some of the funding won't even get to them. So, there's a lot of different things that need to be addressed when it comes to water, and I think that's also where that intersection comes in.
Yeah, sure. Another thing I wanted to touch on real quick is, Latino, Latina, Latinx. That's I think, a phrase that's come in, a word rather, that's come a little bit more mainstream, and maybe people don't understand what that. Could you explain that for folks?
Of course, yes. So Latinx, and I guess I should say, even in our community, this is still something that's new. And again, we're not a monolith. We have opinions, and we all have different identities. There's Afro-Latinos that have more African descents. There's more indigenous Latinos. There's Latinos that don't even, they're more tied to their where they came from. So some of them, will say they're Mexican Americans or Chicanos, which means that they've been here for many generations. So there's a lot of words out there. But Latinx really speaks to a couple of things. One is, just like we're starting to recognize non-binary people that don't identify as she or he, they identify as they. Latinx kind of speaks a little bit to that, and making sure that they're non-binary Latino Latinx people feel recognized. So there's a little bit of that. And then it also comes into our language, and our language is very, we have feminine and male words. So kind of getting a little bit rid of that, because the male dominates the language. So speaking a little bit about equality in the sexes by using Latinx.
And very simply, like, the O is the male and A is the female side, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And even in Latin America, there's Latine with an E.
Okay.
So, yes. And that speaks to Spanish speaking as their dominant language. Latinx is something that isn't recognized, or, that isn't understandable. So it's Latine in Spanish.
Great. Thank you. Last topic area I wanted to ask you about is part of your title, and that's the oceans and the coasts. And I think that's something you might have a personal affinity for as well. What's your connection to the ocean and the coasts?
Yeah, so I'm actually, that's kind of, I grew up right next to the ocean in Monterey Bay. Well, I should say I'm an immigrant myself. So I actually moved from Mexico City when I was 8 years old. I landed here in California next to the Monterey Bay. And it was a place that's really beautiful if you've ever been. Very beautiful coastlines, rocky shores. It's also a marine protected area. And so very beautiful coast. When I was growing up, I didn't have a connection to the ocean as I should. And, talking about those accessibility issues that we mentioned before, it wasn't a place that I felt seen. It wasn't a place that I felt safe as an immigrant. And it wasn't until I got to college that I was able to connect with the ocean, learn about its history, and really started my work in the environmental field, working in ocean conservation. So that is how I kind of got into ocean work, and eventually learned more about water. And all waterways do lead back to the ocean. So we need to be full water advocates, both for the water issues and the ocean issues.
Yeah. I'm a water person, but I like my water with lots of salt in it. I'm an ocean person, through and through. So when it comes to GreenLatinos, what are your concerns with the oceans and the coasts? What are your real concerns, and what are you trying to do there?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, having equitable access to our public lands and also our ocean, our coastlines, our beaches is still a real concern for us as Latinos, as Latinx, but also as in the BIPOC field. It's something that we're working towards having. So really making sure that our communities, historically overlooked communities, feel welcomed, that they find their own history and their own heritage, their own culture reflected in the stories that are told, and that places are protected, or people places are protected that are, speaking to our culture, speaking to our history, but also people that are working in the outdoor industry, in the outdoor fields, in the national park services, in fish and wildlife, NOAA, represent the community that they're serving, representing us. And, representation really matters. Like I mentioned before, I never really felt the conservation movement was for me, and because I didn't see anybody that looked like me either. And so now it's really making sure that people see themselves in these fields. Is one thing that we're really focusing on when it comes to ocean work. Another thing is focusing on plastic pollution. And plastics just seem to follow me everywhere in my field. I did some local state and state work here in California to reduce single-use plastics, and now I'm working on the federal level to do that with GreenLatinos. And it's really telling the whole story of plastics, right? Plastic is just not a waste accumulation. It's also, when you're looking at the holistic story of plastic, it's an environmental justice issue, because it's impacting our communities from extraction all the way to end of life. It is a climate crisis issue because we know that the fossil fuel industry is moving towards gearing up their plastic production as we move towards more renewable energy. So in these issues of incineration, here in California, where I'm based, we're seeing the last two incinerators in our communities are in Latino communities, in Modesto and in Long Beach. And, we know that these have impacts in our health, asthma rates, in our reproduction system. So this is a real concern to our communities. And, one of the things when it comes to plastics is that, we need to reduce single-use plastics, and our communities know how to do that the best. We reduce and we reuse everything. We all have a drawer full of plastics bags that we reuse over and over again. We have containers, from butter containers to sour cream containers, that we use as Tupperware. So it's something that, we want to recognize the disparities, but also celebrate the ways that we are helping reduce single-use plastic pollution. And the last thing I'll say when it comes to our ocean work is, working to make sure that the ocean is looked as a solution to the climate crisis. And, by protecting and restoring places that are going to have a great impact on reducing the CO2 levels, like kelp forests, mangroves, corals. By protecting and restoring these areas, it's also creating a buffer for coastal communities when it comes to hurricanes and storms and sea level rise. So making sure that there's that, recognition that by restoring these, it's not just for flora, fauna, or biodiversity, which are all great things, but it's also going to help with the climate change crisis, and it's going to help our coastal communities and our Latino and other communities of color.
Fantastic. As an ocean lover, I appreciate hearing all of that. Really terrific points. And yeah, that plastic pollution is following us everywhere. That is for sure. Yes. Mariana, I appreciate all this information and perspective. Really educational for me, and I'm sure others. And as I spoke off air, I definitely want to continue exploring the challenges and also the solutions when it comes to water and Latinos. So, but thank you for this conversation today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Really appreciate your time, and thank you for giving the space.
Waterloop.
Thanks, everyone, for listening to today's episode. A special thanks to Waterloop supporters Spring Point Partners and the Walton Family Foundation. The Waterloop podcast is sponsored by High Sierra Showerheads, the smart, stylish way to save energy, water, and money while enjoying a powerful shower. Use promo code LOOP20 for 20% off at highsierrashowerheads.com. If you like Waterloop, please subscribe to the YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on social media and visit waterloop.org to sign up for updates.
Waterloop, Waterloop, Waterloop.